you want to be capable of non-violence, you have to understand your violent capacities, right? And get in right relationship with them. That is what it means to truly be non-violent. To truly be non-violent doesn't mean you try to like suppress your violence, because it will come out in unconscious ways. And I think that's what we're seeing with the secular humanists / woke worlds. They're like trying to get rid of darkness, and then their darkness ends up coming out in unconscious ways.
Hey guys, so before we get started with this week's podcast, I want to remind you that we have our retreats for sale this year. So we do have one of our retreats sold out, but we still have spots for 2 of our retreats. And if you love the content that we've been putting out with the Evolve, Move, Play podcast, and you want to really understand in your body what it's like to put together deep movement practice with mindfulness, with nature connection, and with community, you owe it to yourself to jump on a call and see if these events are right for you. So you can jump on the link in my bio, and I look forward to seeing you on the call. Chloe, it's been a long time. Welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast.
Thank you, Rafe. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I've been anticipating this conversation for like a year. It's been a year since the last time we actually did a podcast together. We've had a few chances to chat since then. There's that first conversation, I wanted to connect on some of the broader ideas that we share in common, some of those things. But one of the reasons that I reached out to you originally is because I feel like the communities that I'm in, the movement community in particular, really need to hear your message, because there has been a big pickup of the kind of social justice, critical theory approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts. And so I wanted to make this conversation more specifically about what's happening there, why it's happening, and how we can have a more sophisticated and nuanced conversation about it, and how we can do it better, because it doesn't feel like it's being done very well right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to have that conversation. I'm very curious about how you see the critical theory sort of mentality informing the movement world.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that. Let's start with, I think, last time we didn't do a lot to introduce you to the audience. I think I probably did a formal introduction before you came on, but I think it'd be useful to just have you break down your background and why you're kind of working in this area. So I think it's very interesting. We were talking online or offline before we turn the recording on, about how you're working specifically with like healing the gap between the Jewish people and the Black people in a specific organization. And, that's kind of interesting for you because you had this background religiously of growing up in a Christian household that had a very specifically kind of Jewish orientation. So why don't we start there and how that evolved into the activism you did in college, and then how that kind of informed your worldview and how you got into the theory of enchantment.
Sure. So I grew up in New Orleans, born and raised in New Orleans, in a Christian family that didn't observe any mainstream Christian festivals, holidays like Christmas or Easter, but celebrated all Jewish festivals like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, kept the Sabbath day, went to church on Saturday instead of Sunday, with the idea that the original founders of Christianity were observing Christianity in this particular way, and with the idea that it wasn't until the rise of the Roman Catholic Church that certain festivals started getting changed and swapped out into new festivals. That's broadly speaking how I grew up. And that did 2 things that shaped my understanding of the world and interest in the world. Number one, it gave me an affinity for Jewish culture, the Jewish community in general, and consequently an aversion to anti-Semitism. And it also made me incredibly curious about the world, because, for example, on Christmas morning, I didn't spend my Christmas mornings under a tree unwrapping presents. I spent my Christmas mornings in the living room with my parents, talking about Emperor Constantine, literally reading over historical documents about how Emperor Constantine changed different dates and times and things of that nature. So it gave me a sense of history and place outside my immediate locale. And it gave me a sense of time. as well. And so in high school, I started getting more interested in Zionism, the movement to reestablish the state of Israel. I started reading books by Leon Uris, who was a really famous like writer about this, a fictional writer about this during the 20th century, I'd say. And then in college, I majored in international studies with a concentration in conflict and diplomacy, and had an Israel club on campus called Allies of Israel, where me and my friends brought in like pro-Israel speakers to come speak and, talk about, give the Israeli perspective vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At some point, though, I started realizing that the strictly political, polemical approach to solving conflict was flawed. Our friend John Vervaeke would say that it was based in adversarial processing instead of opponent processing, and it wasn't able to capture what we were trying to hopefully and ultimately do and be in service of, which was like a path to peace. And it was only until I discovered Israeli literature, contemporary Israeli literature, written by people like Amos Oz, that were able to capture the imperfections of Israeli society, the flaws of Israeli society in a tender, vulnerable, compassionate way, and of Palestinian society as well, that I was able to start shifting from a more political way of thinking or adversarial way of thinking to a more opponent processing, compassionate way of thinking. So this was around the time that I graduated from college. And after that, I moved to New York, where I got a job at the Wall Street Journal, where I was still interested by this question of how to combat anti-Semitism in a way that's sustainable. And the ideas that I came up with were, how do you actually teach people how to love in general? Instead of asking, how do you combat conflict? How do you teach people how to love? And then I started to study, well, what are the things that people are already in love with? And then I started to study pop culture, because pop culture shows you what you gravitate towards as a society, as a zeitgeist. So I started studying things like Nike and Disney and Apple, all of these cultural artifacts really that have religious like devotion from many of its fans, so to speak. And I started to search for patterns. I started to search for common denominators that these brands, stories that these brands were telling over and over again, that got us to sort of like really commit to these brands. And the stories that they were telling were stories of, some imperfect, flawed being has to go through a series of obstacles and comes out of those series of obstacles renewed, connected to their higher self, way more capable of achieving their higher potential. And this seemed to be the kind of pattern that a lot of these stories were tapping into, a lot of these brands were tapping into. And so I was like, oh, this is a phenomenon. This is happening enough times that it's a phenomenon. And I decided to call that phenomenon enchantment. And the reason why I called it enchanting was because when I think of enchantment, or two reasons. When I think of enchantment, I think of this sort of like gradual opening up of oneself to oneself and to the world, which I think is the seed that is necessary for love. If I want to learn how to love others, I really have to learn how to love myself and to be in right relationship with all parts of myself. And so there's this like, the way a flower sort of opens up is how I would describe enchantment. It's like a type of, it's not enlightenment, right? It's not like blinding light being like shine down on someone. It's this delicate interplay between light and dark. And that's what Israeli fiction and Israeli literature was doing. It was showing me the light and the dark of Israeli society and giving me the capacity to hold it all, as opposed to the more polemical approach, which was more to deny the darkness and present Israel as this sort of absolutely perfect, which I can't relate to because I'm not perfect, and no one else can relate to it either. That's the first reason why I called it enchantment. The second reason why I called it enchantment was because Guy Kawasaki. I came across this book by Guy Kawasaki, who wrote a book called Enchantment, who talked about he was Apple's former marketing director. So he talked about how Steve Jobs believed in this concept of enchantment, called it the process by which you delight someone. And again, there's that interplay of light there, where you delight someone with a product, with an idea, with another human being, something. When I think of delight, I think of a kind of opening up, like something's opening. And it's a kind of expansiveness that is coming from within. And enchantment is obviously also a central theme in Disney, which was another brand I was studying at the time. So that's why I like, oh, this phenomenon is enchanting. And then I was like, oh, it's enchantment. So after that, I wrote a paper on this at the journal, and after that, I started to take this idea, which basically said, if you want to teach people how to love, you have to give people a process by which to open themselves up, both to themselves and to the world around them, so that love can kind of come in. So I took that idea and I started to refine it for the next 2 years. And I created like these 3 rules or principles. And the principles are treat people, like human beings, not political abstractions, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy, and try to root everything you do in love and compassion. And I was lecturing on this in many places. This is between 2016 and 2018.
Yeah.
And then I was working for a nonprofit at the time, but that was essentially like a catalyst through which I could refine my ideas. And then I went off on my own and created Theory of Enchantment, like LLC.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know what to do with it. At the time, I just had this idea and the 3 principles. And I reached out to people, I asked them for their advice. And some people said, why don't you think about creating a course based upon these 3 principles? So that's what I set out to do. I created a course heavily centered around pop culture anchors, because it was pop culture that enabled me to see this pattern in the first place. And so I created a course, and it was all about self-discovery and really confronting the self, interrogating the self, learning to discern, when you're projecting things out onto people versus when you're speaking from your centered sense of self. And I use different pop culture references to help guide people on that journey. So like, Jay-Z talking about how he realized that when someone was being threatening towards him, it was actually because that person was scared. Yeah. Right. Or, talking about the Disney film Inside Out, which is about what's happening internally in a person that gives rise to the facades that we project. Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, a great psychotechnology that helped people deal with alienation is elements of that is seen in like Disney's The Lion King. So I built out this, and at the time I was actually wanting to give the curriculum to high schools as a kind of social emotional learning program. And I should say, it also included, teachings by Dr. King and Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, because all these people also had this capacity to ask what was going on within the interior of a human being that is causing them to produce, let's say, bigotry or prejudice, etc. Yeah. So I wanted to sell it as a curriculum to high schools, and high schools are bureaucratic. So that proved to be very, very difficult. This was in 2019. Yeah. It was very, very difficult. But I was, I was trying. I was getting talks here and there, but I wasn't, getting the sale, so to speak. And then in 2020,
Yeah.
Remember that year, that wonderful year that descended upon all of us. 2020 emerged, and all of a sudden you have incredible amount of scarcity, both you know materially in the form of COVID-19, but also psychologically, people are feeling isolated, lack of belonging, etc. You have what I would call the twin pillar of a rising interest in overcoming racial injustice, let's say, with the rise of with the murder of George Floyd, the rise of Black Lives Matter, the protests in the streets, all of these things. These are happening at the same time and feeding off of each other. And with this interest in race, there comes along with it all of a sudden an interest in theory of enchantment. And it was fascinating because I didn't initially market it as a diversity and inclusion training.
Yeah.
It was other people, particularly people at other companies, who were being asked to sit in workshops that were of a different, let's say, approach to combating racism. They were the people who were saying to me, Chloe, this is an anti-racism course. And indeed it is, because it teaches you ultimately how to love. I mean, it truly is an anti-racism course. It just so happens that the ultimate like objective of it is to teach people how to love. And so it's so like as a byproduct, it naturally teaches you how to fight against racism. So that's like the 360
Yeah. It was great.
overview.
It was great to hear that story. And it was particularly interesting to kind of like having that frame of, where you started with your religious upbringing. And I could kind of imagine this sense of like you had a deep care for an interest in the Middle East conflict and anti-Semitism. And how do you overcome these really deeply entrenched antipathies between different ethnic groups, right?
Yeah.
And that led you down the path of trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to help people actually fall in love with each other? And then that obviously has application as sort of racial antipathy just explodes really in the last 5 years or so in this country. So yeah, that was very interesting. There's a couple of things that you said that I really liked. One was you kept pointing to this metaphor of like a flower that's opening out. And I was recently with John Vervaeke at like a wisdom conference, and there was another guy there, Steve Marsh, and he was talking about the idea that self-development is better thought of as an unfolding process than a developmental process or or like a constructive process. You don't want to necessarily construct your character because that can be very artificial. What you want to do is kind of remove the negative constraints and allow that flower to come forth. And so I think that's a beautiful analogy to think about what we're trying to achieve. And then the second thing that you flipped over was this. I can't precisely pick up exactly what you're saying, but it kept reminding me of John Vervaeke's language of reciprocal narrowing versus reciprocal opening, right?
Yeah.
That what you're seeking in training people is to help them learn to reciprocally open within themselves to the world, and in conflict management to reciprocally opening to each other. And in some sense, you've said that has to start in the self. You have to be reciprocally opening to the aspects of the self before you can reciprocally open to the other. And that a lot of these, this sort of tendency to bite onto racial antipathy or other types of antipathy is actually about a kind of reciprocally narrowing thing within the self. Does that language resonate for you?
Yes, I love the framework of reciprocal narrowing versus reciprocal opening, especially because with racial antipathy, what is happening in the background is a lot of fear of the other. Yeah. And I think it's fear in general that results often in that kind of reciprocal narrowing. Certainly, paranoia is an outcome of that kind of fear. So yeah, I really that framework really resonates with me.
I've been reading Morris Berman's book, The Re-Enchantment of the Earth, which I think I mentioned you before, but I think you might.
Beautiful title.
Yeah. But he talks about the process of schismogenesis, right? Of how like groups will break apart because there's types of conflict that aren't that you're not able to deal well. And he analogizes this actually to what happens with an addiction. Addiction, and that of course comes back to that. Addiction is a reciprocally narrowing process where you all of your behavior sort of falls down the well of feeding this one aspect. Alcohol addiction, pornography, video games, whatever it is, right? You start cutting off all these pieces of yourself in order to say, okay, I'm going to do this. It's like, oh, I'm an honest person, but I need heroin, so maybe I'm going to steal from my mom. And now you're letting go of your commitment to honesty, and those are all reciprocally narrowing. And I feel in some sense like I think that we become addicted to outrage, right? We become addicted to polarization. I think I'm not sure the relationship between the sort of general outrage across the political spectrum and the specific outrage around race that's happening right now. But it feels like they're interrelated and they're not necessarily exactly the same. But there is this sense of an addiction to that. And I've been thinking about this because, well, the question I wanted to ask you is, why has race become so salient in the American political landscape within the last 5 years? Like, okay, I'll stop there. I'll let you.
It's a big question. Like why race and not class, for example?
Yeah. You can see like the race and gender or race and sex seem to kind of go in waves too, right? It was like Me Too was big, and then Black Lives Matter sort of took the air in the space. Now it feels like trans issues are maybe are taking more of the air in the space right now. But I don't know what point I was trying to make, but race has become super salient in a way that is surprising. And like one of the things, like I was listening to a podcast you did with Christopher Rufo this morning. And I think Christopher Rufo does some really important research. And I'm also kind of skeptical of his presence on the political spectrum. And I feel the same way about James Lindsay, who I know you've had both some connections with and some
beef,
conflict, some beef with. Whereas I think that like he's doing really great research in untangling the kind of intellectual roots of these things, but there's a way in which I feel like it's myopic, right? He's focusing on one strain of a multi-causal problem to the point where it's somewhat distorting. And one of the things that I really like about your work is I think that you're pointing to strains that I don't see other people pointing to. A lot of the emotional layer, a lot of the implicit layer, a lot of the like spiritual and virtue layers that don't seem to be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I'm not sure I know why race has become so salient in the past 5 years. I like why race specifically. I could guess that the African American community has become a kind of talisman in the eyes of many. Actually, I could argue both on the left and the right. The African American community has become a kind of talisman. Probably in part because as Americans we do find ourselves wanting to grapple with our quote unquote original sin, slavery. This is something that has never fully been, I would say, consciously grappled with as a nation. And I think that the pent up frustrations that were in part caused by the isolation and the sense of alienation of COVID, sort of, it just like caught fire. I thought like all the factors that could possibly be in place were in place in 2020. You have people who are super, super isolated and alienated and feeling a loss of belonging. You have other scarcity issues that are sort of unseen because no one's seeing each other. It's not transparent, that are happening in different homes across the nation because of that alienation. An easy example is like, schools shutting down and kids being forced to, go to English on Zoom, and let's say a home with a single mom and, not enough resources to actually deal with that is present. So you have scarcities, like micro scarcities like that happening. You have social media, right? Yeah. Where talk about salience, right? Where we are able to see things like the murder of George Floyd on camera, but like multiple times a day, going viral. Everyone can see it. It's being broadcasted to everyone at such a fast rate, and people are responding to it immediately, also vis-a-vis social media or via social media. And so, and emotions are high. Platform like Twitter is highly incentivized towards adversarial processing. And yeah, so I think you have all these different micro and macro factors that spun up in 2020 and just like sort of a flash in the pan moment. But I don't think, I'd be curious to see like the staying power of it. I mean, obviously it's, sometimes I can be a little maybe too hopeful because I'm operating from where I'm operating.
Yeah.
And I'm less aware of like the day-to-day ways in which other people are actually still dealing with like the critical race theory sort of approaches or lenses being implemented in their environments, in their communities. So I'm sort of separated from it a little bit. Yeah. So, but I don't think it was predictable though.
Yeah. I think there's an element of, there's stochastic elements or random elements, right? Like, I actually think like the death of Tumblr is like a weirdly important moment in deranging the entire political dialogue. Well, like I've been around the internet long enough that I can kind of like track some of these trends mentally. So a lot of the dialogue that you see now, this really hyper emotional, angry, grievance-driven dialogue. I remember that being big on LiveJournal in the mid-aughts, right, or late aughts. And then it moved to Tumblr, and Tumblr became the place where it was all crazy. And then Tumblr banned pornography, which was what was driving a lot of people to Tumblr. Oh, wow. And then essentially somehow like the site just really got smaller and everybody fled and they ended up on Twitter and Facebook. And then it was like that stuff permeated everything. But so I think that's a trigger, right? It's like, it's just these random things or the algorithm deciding that this is what's going to drive clicks right now. So I think that's part of it. I think there's one of the things that I was thinking about is, let me back up for a second. If we, someone might be listening to this saying, well, obviously race is important right now. Black men are getting shot on the street, right? Like it's been, 450 years and we still haven't solved the problem of race in America. And they might think that, like things haven't gotten better. And I think that a lot of times the information about how things have gotten better isn't actually accessible to people. So, just as a background for people who maybe aren't aware, if you look at something like attitudes towards interracial marriage, since the 1960s, I think we've gone from like 80% disapproval to 93% approval of interracial marriage. If you look at like the warmth that, like how white Americans perceive Black Americans, whether they're antipathic to them or positive towards them or have good images, like basically it's all going in a positive direction. Yeah. Right. There's lots of there's lots of positive trajectories that we don't really hear about. And what, so, sorry, too many thoughts. I'm kind of just trying to organize them here. But you kept mentioning 2020, but for me, this goes back to like 2016. I mean, it goes back even further, but it was 2016 where I really started to see that it go kind of crazy. And it started not with George Floyd, but with Trayvon Martin. Right? Trayvon Martin was killed, and Obama said that could have been my son, right? And his image was everywhere, and people became hyper concerned about the threat that young Black men faced in America. And I had studied enough about the rates of interracial crime and everything to know that was not statistically correct, that there wasn't a huge amount of murder of young Black men by the police or by white men, right? The interracial violence gap is the other direction. And I wanted to express this after George Floyd was killed. But everyone was so angry. I just felt like it would just ignite rage to say it, right? People weren't
ready. Right, by the way, it would have.
People wouldn't, if you said this is what the FBI said, they'd just tell you that the FBI is wrong, right? And they're seeing it, right? They're seeing the Trayvon Martin story. They're seeing, they're seeing the George Floyd story. Everyone's seen the George Floyd story. Nobody's seen the Tony Timpa story. And I felt like there's a specific young Black man who's a really prominent member of the parkour community. And he writes a lot on his Instagram about how he trains indoors almost exclusively because he's worried that he'll get killed by the police if he goes and trains outside. And I think that this is really disempowering to young Black men, right? And women, right? Because he's spreading a paranoia that's not rooted in fact.
Well, this is interesting though, because as you were describing this, I started thinking about who's the famous writer?
What do you write about?
Who writes about enlightenment?
Steven Pinker.
Yes. Okay. So this is a very Pinker-esque, formulation. It's like so much has gotten better, but I think what's actually happening is that even though materially things have gotten better, from a meaning perspective, things have gotten worse.
Yes.
And this is the central issue. And that is the central issue. And there's something interesting to be said. Christopher Lasch wrote this incredible book called The True and Only Heaven, which I highly recommend, where he talks about Dr. King and how in the beginning and the middle of Dr. King's, let's call it reign, he was promoting a politics, or rather a spiritual discipline against the politics of resentment, right? And at the heart of this spiritual discipline was able to create meaning, and he was able to plant this seed or co-create this really with other Black leaders in the South. And this is interesting though, because the South was obviously rife with Jim Crow laws, right? The worst from a legislative perspective, the worst, deeply enshrined prejudices, bigotries, systemic racism in the true meaning of the word systemic, right? And simultaneously, though, there was meaning in these communities, which is interesting, right? These communities had vibrant churches, Black-owned businesses that were able to create the sort of economic leverage to enable them to boycott the Montgomery bus, in the first place, right? So you have this interesting dichotomy of incredible persecution and a sense of existential meaning that cannot be measured by, merely material means, right? Merely economic measurement. Man does not live by bread alone. Someone said that. I don't know. But then,
Yeah.
right. Dr. King, Christopher Lasch points out, tries to go to the north, where there isn't Jim Crow laws, and certainly not in the same way, right?
Mm-hmm.
There isn't this sort of systemic legal disenfranchisement. Remember, you have a whole Black migration happening from the South to the North in search of economic opportunity.
Yeah.
And yet, King finds that in the North, people are not simply not organizing to vote. They don't even think that there's anything worth voting about. Right. And actually Lasch argues that instead of trying to promote integration in the North, King should have actually gone into the ghettos to create community. Those communities were already existing in the South, which created that foundation from which political action could emerge. And so I think that I think we're dealing with a similar issue here. It is the case that, you know, everything you pointed out is true. There's been movement in terms of interracial progress, but I would guess that this is true for all races, probably. I mean, I might be overstating that, but I would guess that this is true for many ethnic communities within America, that meaning has plummeted. Yeah. And that's the issue that we have to deal with.
Yeah. So that was in my little notes here on why race now. I have ideology, like talk about the impact of these specific ideologies, like James Lindsay has documented, and Christopher Ruth. I have grief, right? Like people, like I thought about this, like you don't get angry, you don't feel intense grief just like in a linear timeline. It's not like something bad happens, you feel really bad and then less bad over like a consistent time. It's like it comes up in wells. It's like part of the reason that people are upset about race now might just be that that's the random expression of when the grief happens, and it still hasn't been processed. It still hasn't been dealt. And then the last one,
the outlet.
Yeah. The last one is it's another species. It's another output of the meaning crisis. And I wanted to go. I wanted to touch on what you said earlier about how Black Americans are treated as talismans. So one of my Black friends in the parkour community, I had a conversation with him sometime during COVID year, and we were talking about the kind of takeover of the parkour community by like this really woke sort of virtue signaling, and he was talking specifically about what had happened during after George Floyd was murdered, right? So he's a gay Black man who grew up in Atlanta, right? Middle class. So all of these white parkour athletes started calling him and asking him how he was doing, right? And his first reaction was like, this is the story that I've been living with my whole life, right? Like I've always been aware that the bad things can happen to Black people for being Black. Like, why are you calling me now?
Yeah.
And then his second thing was they didn't really want to talk to him about what was happening to them. What he felt like eventually was that they wanted him to sort of shrive them of their sins for having been white when something like this happened.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, when I was talking to him, I was thinking about, white men getting down or white women getting down and washing the feet of Black men on the street during the George Floyd protest.
I remember this. Yeah. I forgot that happened. Yeah.
I remember walking through Seattle and seeing shrines, right? Like mirrors and, dream catchers and like art and images and, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Ibram X. Kennedy's names put up like in strange mosaics on people's yards. Like I sent one of these to John Vervaeke and I was like, this is an altar, right?
Yeah.
It's an altar. And so what I said to him was that I think that within wokeness, there's a hunger for something religious and spiritual.
For sure.
And that what has happened in some sense has been the replacement of the suffering of Jesus on the cross as the kind of central narrative around which things are organized, to the Black experience of slavery as the central narrative of suffering, which organizes our spirituality. And what I was saying to him was that this actually puts Black people in a really difficult position.
Yeah.
Because they become the dispensators of freedom from sin, right? You have to check your privilege. Checking your privilege is confessing your sins. And there's a weird way in which it becomes very self-serving, right? The Black community becomes a talisman by which the white community can express their sins.
Yes. Yes. This is a very difficult puzzle.
Yeah.
Because it turns Black people into saviors. It's sort of like the inversion of the white man's burden. Now it becomes the Black man's burden to, atone white people for their sins. And then I think we would have to solve for this. We might have to talk about, I don't know how obscure you want to go, but like, Neoplatonist forms of Christianity versus, other forms of Christianity that are certainly alive and well in our unconscious psyches. I don't know if you've read Dominion by Tom Holland.
Yeah.
So how he talks about, and I think he said, I actually saw him in California a few months ago. He said that like Nietzsche predicted the turning of the victim into an idol as a byproduct of Christianity. This is a serious problem, right? This creates serious issues because it enshrines victimhood as something to aspire towards. It also lays the foundation for narcissistic personality disorder because your sense of self becomes dependent upon an external validator, and then you just find yourself looking for an external validator, right? I think that you're seeing those elements also play itself out in wokeness, which is so funny because woke is a euphemism for becoming enlightened, right?
Yeah.
Like you can see these historical forces still very much alive today.
You could translate Buddha, right? It's like, are you a god? No. Are you a man? No. What are you? I'm woke, bro.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but it's very damaging, obviously, from an organizing perspective.
So I think that is a really important aspect to deal with. And I think like Jonathan Pageau and his work and like conceptualizing some of this stuff is really valuable. I want to go back to this question, so I'm, the parkour community is really important to me and the movement community. And like a lot of the woke religion it's been widely adopted within that community. And I think that it is literally hurting people, right? It is like people are, I just finished Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. He was talking about how we create these cognitive distortions. And so if you believe that you're far more likely to, like that thousands of young Black men are getting killed every year by the police, and you're not going to go train outside because of that, that's a disempowering belief. That's a source of mental anguish that you don't need in your life. And I've thought often about like, how can I have that conversation with somebody? Like, I have good news. You don't actually have to be scared of that. And yet I feel like that good news isn't going to be welcome. And that there's something that I need to do. There's something that I need to do that isn't about knowing the facts.
Right.
To be able to show up the right way for that. Like when I had that, I told you last time about my meditation in the woods and the fire that moved through the forest as anger. And one of the things that I asked was like, so I mean, I think it's like 20 to 40 unarmed Black men are shot every year by the police. And it's about the same number of white men in windshield control for, I mean, that's a very small number among the murders in this country. It's like that's an average weekend in Chicago. Unfortunately, it's not one of the worst problems that we face. And it is disproportionate. More black men are shot by police than white men as a proportion of the population. But once you control for the greater violence in the black community, all these other things, it doesn't look like that. If you look at like controlling for how many incidents there are, the likelihood of fatal shooting is actually lower when it's a black person. But there is the flip side of that, and this is all on Roland Fryer's work for anyone interested in it, which is that black men are still 50% more likely, or black Americans are 50% more likely to be harassed by the police in low-level ways, low-level violence. And most of my black friends in the parkour community have had weird and uncomfortable experiences with the police. So it's easy to say, okay, that's not true, but why does it feel so true? And part of it is this thing. Part of it is, how long has there not been an actual disproportion, right? How many people do you know in your family history, in your community, who can talk about those interactions with the police? And has that been processed? Has that been, I mean, it's like if you're in a relationship with somebody and it starts to get bad, and then you're trying to come back in a relationship. It's like, once you're treating each other well, it's not fixed.
Right.
Because there's this time where
grounding. There has to be a grounding processing time. And if that's absent, then and it is absent. If that's absent, then Vervaeke's 4 ways of knowing. Like there's no like propositional
route there.
There's no propositional route there. There's I suspect there's only the consistent act of showing up in a way that is present, in a way that is informed by all the training that you're doing. Right? In the confidence, right, which literally means like with faith in being, that such a thing will be able to produce a shift in your friend's relationship to reality, which is both hopeful and disappointing, because it means like that you don't have the capacity to like, superimpose a shift in his understanding of reality. It has to be co-created, and so that's why all of this work is hard. Well,
there's this, the call within the social justice space is for white people to be allies, and the way that they conceive of ally, I think, is deeply misleading, right? It's dangerous for both individuals, right? Because it's asking the white person to give up their own moral agency within the situation,
right?
And at the same time, it's empowering the black participant in that conversation, or the whatever the underprivileged minority is in the conversation, to not be reflected back anything that's negative.
Sure.
Which is not a recipe for growing as a human being.
Sure.
So there's a Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, you want as a friend someone who won't give you alcohol if you're an alcoholic. Right?
Yeah.
That's what you need as a friend. When I had that vision of the fire in the forest, I thought to myself, I need friends who are willing to stand with me in the fire, right? Like, we need to be in the process of burning off the deadwood of our character together. And that means that we have to be able to tell the truth to each other.
Yeah.
So, I do have black friends who I tell the truth to. And but then there's like a point where with the community in general, it's like, I don't know how much I can speak the truth as I see it, because it's going to ignite a fire that's damaging to people rather than one that actually is healing. And this is this is why I think I'm so intrigued by your work, because I can go to Rufo, I can go to to James Lindsay. I can go to other people and just get facts, right? And I feel like Sam Harris and Steven Pinker and all these people, they're laying out these really beautiful, rational, consistent, coherent arguments, and they're landing flat.
Mm-hmm.
They're not penetrating, right?
Yeah.
The situation is getting worse despite the beauty of their argumentation, because they're not getting that it's not as simple as a misunderstanding of propositions.
Right.
And so this is why we need to talk about grief, and we need to talk about the meaning crisis, and we need to talk about spirituality, which is a weird thing for me to say. I've always been a skeptic of spirituality, but that's something that is fascinating to me in this story. Like, it feels like there's kind of two narratives about the Black community that are competing. One is that everything that's wrong with Black Americans is because of the sins of white Americans. And so white Americans just have to confess their sins, which is like, nothing gets better because of that, right? Like if you just, if you're in a relationship with somebody, and you were just like, yeah, I cheated on you. Yeah, I beat you up. Yeah, I did. And you did that every day. I'm so sorry that I did these terrible things. But you didn't actually fix their car or pay, like, it's,
well, it's the continual belief in propositions. Like that's what it is all the way down. Like if you were to, have a James Lindsay next to, let's say, an Ibram Kendi, it's propositions all the way down.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how the Cartesian mindset has like really infected us all the way down. Like we're all guilty of it. It's not like one side, so to speak, has the exclusive, domain of this. But we gotta talk about spirituality.
So
that, and I think that Sam Harris actually, it's funny to me because I talked to him about this briefly. Like he shows up very differently on the his waking up app than the way he's shown up in conversations and in when he was on Twitter. Like I find a lot of meaning and a lot of richness, a lot of practical tools from his waking up app that he's not bringing onto his live conversation. Like when he was like going over all these facts about, policing and police brutality in 2020, there was none of the waking up Sam Harris brought in.
It's a different mode.
That. Yeah, it's integrated.
Yeah. So I want to just go back to this idea. So you have the narrative that it's just white people's fault, and that somehow if we just feel guilty enough, it'll fix the problem, which is really absurd to me. And then the flip side is that, like, bad things happen to Black people, but everybody's had to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. The Black community just has to take responsibility, which is sort of the right wing side. And then there's the extreme right wing side, which is like Black people are just not able to pick themselves up. They're additionally less capable than other people. And like listening to your work and then like listening to James Baldwin, I listened to that The Fire Next Time over the weekend. I just finished that this morning. I was struck by, and I read Dr. King's book last year, The Strength of Love. I was struck by like the historical uniqueness and extraordinary virtue of the civil rights movement, right? Like obviously there were flaws and there were people, but like it's an extraordinary accomplishment. And on both sides in a way. Like I think that one thing that we really don't do in this country is have enough of a sense of history. Like there aren't other historical experiments where a former enslaved population and the former slave masters are actually trying to find equality and a positive relationship together. Like in most situations, the slaves were worked to death and didn't even populate each other. And there was never the attempt to let go of the idea of the supremacy of the dominant group, right? The Romans didn't let go of that. The Chinese didn't let go of that.
Mm-hmm.
The Ottomans didn't let go of that. It was just like, that's the bread root. It's so funny that people talk so much about being a white supremacist country.
Mm.
And whiteness is a weird historical construction. It's different than Ottomanness or Chineseness, but it's not that different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there's something virtuous, and I think it is something that, as Tom Holland would say, comes out of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is happening with white Americans, and part of it is being deeply resisted by very pernicious things in white Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is really coming from Black Americans, like Dr. King and like James Baldwin. And, you know, as a white American who's had, you know, like, in some sense injured by some of these ideologies, right? Because it got into me early. Like, listening to James Baldwin was hard. It was painful to listen to his resentment and his rage about what was happening in America in the 1960s. But it was like, it was deeply informative in a really powerful way, right? Because it's just one man's perspective, but it's a deeply thought and felt and sensitive perspective that's being shared out there.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the big problems with the current dialogue is it doesn't actually respect the accomplishment of Black Americans in general. Right? There's so much story about Black oppression, and there's so little story about Black achievement in America. Which is really, like, if you look at it from a global perspective, like, how many ethnicities have as many widely admired figures, have contributed as much to the culture of the world right now over the last 100 years than Black Americans? And yet that part of the story of the experience seems to be consistently forgotten. And I think that it's key to building the grounds for something else, because, like you said, it's about falling in love. Right? Rock and roll helps white America fall in love with Black America.
Yeah, I think it's hard to take in the accomplishments of a people if your sense of self is dependent upon emphasizing that people's degradation. I mean, we're back to the same problem, right? And also, I don't think the accomplishments or even the moral fiber of the civil rights movement is taken in, because I don't think it's known. Like, I had a very unique educational upbringing, I've come to realize. Like, the schools that I went to in my elementary education many of them were predominantly African American, and not just predominantly African American, but engaged with that tradition. Like, that tradition was infused into the curriculum, right? Like, I had to memorize speeches by Maya Angelou as a 6-year-old. Like, it was very much this kind of Booker T. Washington-esque train the mind, like, school or schooling that I received, and that I've realized that that's just, like, not widespread in America at all. So there's different pieces that need to be tackled. There's the piece of institutional learning and, like, what is the purpose of an education? You know, there's the the birth of spirituality within secular America leads to these weird outcomes where, because human beings are spiritual, it's just a fact, our spirituality ends up getting discharged in these very weird ways. And so I don't even know that there's room for an appreciation of the accomplishments at the present moment if your sense of self is animated by these other anxieties and dependent upon them, right? Like, if it's like the frame problem, like Vervaeke talks
Mhm.
about, like
Yeah.
we're looking through a frame, and in some ways you could say this is a very scary statement, but in some ways you could say it hasn't become scarce enough for whoever we're talking about, Black and white America alike. It hasn't become scarce enough for us to do this and look at the glasses. We're
Mhm.
still looking through the glasses with the muck and,
Yeah.
and it hasn't become blurry enough for us to realize that, oh, we need to like take them off and like wipe them and see what's up with the construction, with the way they've been constructed.
Yeah. What struck me when you were saying that about the frame is that in some sense, like Black and white America can never have peace until we can retire the frame of the slaver and the enslaved, which is a difficult frame to retire.
But this is a Christian problem.
Yeah, tell me more.
I mean, I could be wrong, but I think ultimately this is a Christian issue. Because I said this to someone, I said this on Twitter the other day. I came across a piece that was about wokeness. It was like a Christian response to wokeness, and it was like, we need to sort of like highlight the the phrase that Paul says, in Christianity there's neither Gentile nor Jew. There's
neither man nor
Christian.
woman. Yeah.
Right. And this is going to be the framework, the paradigm that successfully dispenses with wokeness. And my pushback to that was, yes, but Christianity also produces this this upholding of the victim.
Yeah.
Right, as the ideal thing to be. And it seems to me that unless you deal with that directly and head on, you're going to continue to have this problem. We need to make the shift from there's neither Gentile nor Jew to, and this happened a little in the civil rights movement.
Neither slave nor master.
There's neither slave nor master. Right?
Neither Gentile nor Jew, neither man nor woman, slave nor master. We're all one in the body of Christ. It's not exactly that, but that's very close to what it says.
So I think that there's neither slave nor master never hasn't been taken seriously enough.
Yeah. So
I've been frankly harder to actually internalize and to embody.
I've been thinking about, one thing I've been thinking about is that in a lot of ways the progress of the civil rights movement was deeply religious, right? Like, King was a pastor, right?
Yeah.
The Nation of Islam, good and bad, is a religious movement. And then there's a kind of waning of religion over the last half of the 20th century. And there's an idea that we're just progressing towards this sort of universal liberal utopia. And the way that like Pinker or Lindsay or some of these other people respond to the rise of wokeness is to entrench on secular humanism. But my sense is that there's a lot of important aspects of secular humanism that we need to try to retain, but there's a reason why it's not stable. Right? I don't like, I feel like the theory of the Lindsay Ruffo types is that it's just because bad people wrote bad ideology in textbooks and colonized our universities. And I'm like, I don't think that it would have worked if there wasn't a problem that it seemed like an apt solution to. And so that, to me, that's like there has to be a new frame that transcends and includes that says, okay, yes, the problem is still, there, but we can look at it from another frame, right? We can step beyond that. We can't
Go ahead. You first.
We can't simply ignore the underlying spiritual aspects. We also can't ignore the reality of differences, which is sort of the secular humanist approach. And
What do
then,
you mean by that?
so the idea is that we're supposed to be colorblind, right?
Mm,
That was the secular
yeah,
humanist idea. Like,
yeah,
I want to move to a world in which your background and my background just are completely immaterial. But that's
yeah.
kind of absurd. In a way, it's like it's atomizing of the individual
Right,
in a deeply dehumanizing way. Like,
right.
you are a black woman, I am a white man, right?
Yeah.
And we come from specific backgrounds, and that deeply informs who we are in our experience. And
Mm-hmm.
if we can't open that dimension, we can't actually meet each other as fully in reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a
Of
very
course,
abstracting, almost, I'm being really tongue in cheek here, but it's a very abstracting and also colonizing
mm-hmm.
move, in fact, because it disembodies the individual
Yes,
from her locale and from her lived experience as a way to take on the overcorrections of the woke.
yeah, yeah. Well,
And yeah,
yeah. I mean, it wasn't originally conceived to be against the woke, right? It was conceived to be against the
mm,
race, the Nazis, and
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
you know, and other things. And now it's being repurposed, right?
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
but these underlying spiritual dimensions are not there. And you know, as we talked about, there's the sense that there's a weird way in which wokeness makes Black Americans instrumental for white Americans as a way of shriving them of sins.
Mm-hmm.
And like the whole Robin DiAngelo thing, it's so dehumanizing in the relationship between two people. There's my friend who I was telling you we were talking about you know his friend's response to George Floyd, right? It's like when he comes to train with me, or we go to train together, like I don't want him to treat me as a white man specifically, and I don't want to treat him as a black man specifically. I don't want to treat him as a gay man specifically, right? Like there are aspects of a relationship in which that's totally should be immaterial.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also the truth that like to understand him, to deeply empathize with him over time, I have to understand his experience specifically as a black man, specifically as a gay man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if he wants to empathize with me, he has to understand my experience on the other side of that.
Yeah.
So there we have to be able to treat people as humans first to grab some of your language, but not to collapse them only to this individual layer, because that's not actually a real understanding of what a human is.
Right. It's an illusion. And I think that a lot of our problems actually stem from our attempt to seek that utopia that you described the secular humanists as wanting to do. And of course, Holland argues that secular humanism, of course, comes out of Christianity, right? As
Yep.
this kind of side wind, seeking the kingdom of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
this gets taken up in these different iterations, one of which is secular humanism. The problem is that, and I've been grappling with this for a bit, the problem is that if you conceive of utopia as a kind of, I'm writing an essay about this right now, as a kind of total eradication of evil, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
then you create something that is inherently contradictory. You cannot completely eradicate evil. And there are stories in our zeitgeist that show this. For example, like Star Wars with Anakin Skywalker, who tries to completely eradicate, death,
Mm-hmm.
which he conceives of as evil. You can't do that. What you end up doing is you end up eradicating yourself, right? And there's a whole thing in, Jungian thought with regards to shadow work, where you don't want to repress your repressed, or you don't want to repress your aspects of yourself that you don't want. You taught me this, right? You don't want to you don't if you want to be capable of nonviolence, you have to understand your violent capacities,
Mhm.
right? And get in right relationship with them. That is what it means to truly be nonviolent. You
Mhm.
don't, that doesn't, to truly be nonviolent doesn't mean you try to like suppress your violence, because it will come out in unconscious ways. And I think that's what we're seeing with the secular humanists slash, I'll say slash woke
Yeah.
worlds. They're like trying to get rid of darkness, and then their darkness ends up coming out in unconscious ways.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the flaws of, let's say, certain strands of Christianity is this. And the Jungians have pointed this out, by the way. It's this attempt to completely eradicate darkness as enlightenment, right? Blinding light, as opposed to getting in right relationship with darkness. There's a subtle distinction there. And that goes to like that interplay of light and dark that I talked about earlier when describing enchantment. And I think that that's what's going on with a lot of these political movements that are crashing into each other right now.
Yeah. Species of utopianism.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
The desire to not make the world messy. Like thinking a lot about when I was listening to the Fire Next Time. He was talking about the Nation of Islam's desire to have specifically a black nation, right? And you know, he was saying this is just, it was really not well thought out from a logistical economic standpoint, but he understood it.
Sure. Yeah.
And it even plays to what you're saying about King, right? Like rather than just seeking integration, there needed to be the bootstrapping up of the functions within the black community. And you know, we have this whole dialogue that's so incoherent in America around gentrification versus white flight, right? So it's like when white people move into a space where there are you know, underprivileged minorities, we're gentrifying. When we move out of a place where there's underprivileged minorities, it's white flight. So it's like white people just can't move. They have to stay where they are, or else they're sinners, right? But like the reality is that many people prefer some level of commonality, and then there's good reasons why, right? Like you know, your work has been described as like diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and I've kind of just hate that whole term, right? Because I think that the idea that diversity is inherently a strength is a dogma that's not backed by reality. And the
even
idea
from
that,
an evolutionary perspective,
I mean, from just a technical, like just like from a sociological perspective, right? Like if you want to create a team of people to accomplish something, do you want it to be maximally diverse or maximally homogenous? I would say neither, right? And it depends on the type of team that you're creating, right? So the Argentinian soccer team just won the World Cup, right? Argentinian soccer team is very white. It was like a thing on social media. Like, why are the Argentinians so white? You know, it doesn't matter that they're white. It matters that they have a strong sense that they're Argentinian, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So if you have a team where you have Black Americans and white Americans and they have a very strong racial antipathy to each other, that's not going to be a good team generally.
Right.
Now, if you look at economic production and different types of functions, I think that what you'll see is that like cosmopolitan cities are really, really powerful for the production of certain things. Like art is really, really benefited by the meeting of cultural spaces. But I think that like there's also like function to having people who are relatively similar. So I think a country where you have some areas that are relatively homogenous and some areas that are very cosmopolitan works better than just trying to force everything to be San Francisco.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. And equally, it's going to be bad for you if you try to force everything to be Utah, right?
Yeah. You need both. Well, when Steve see the problem or the challenge is when I hear diversity, that's what I hear.
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing is that diversity is conceived of in very weird ways, right? So there's I looked at the diversity ratings of the different schools around Seattle, right? Because they had like it was basically like they have like a just ranking of public schools in Seattle, and my kids were going to start going to school. And then they had, and one of the elements that they're ranked on is diversity. So I was just curious. I was like, okay, what does that mean? And I saw that I think it was Garfield High School was ranked at like the absolute best, most diverse school. It's 94% Black.
Yeah. No, that's not diversity. That's not
right.
Diversity.
It's diversity is percent non-white now.
Right. Which is a problem when that is how diversity is being defined. Yeah.
Yeah. So having diversity, like, and Nassim Taleb has talked a lot about like how like Germany was an extraordinarily productive economic era because they had very diversified power structures, right? So each city could kind of determine its own policies, and then they could compete with each other to see which worked. And because of that, it was very economically dynamic. So that was a layer of diversity. Diversity, you have to be able to choose dimensions along which you want things to be less diverse and dimensions where you want diversity, right? So if you're an NBA team, you don't want necessarily a huge amount of height diversity.
Right.
You don't, or you want the least amount of diversity that you can around shot making ability. You just want it as high as possible and universal across your team.
Right, yeah.
But then you do want diversity in like certain roles that people play. They can't all play the same role. So that's why I struggle with that term. And then inclusion, it's the same thing. If you take any category and you include everything in that category, eventually the category doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Like you have to have diversity and unity, or like complexification, right? John Vervaeke talks about complexification. That's the diversification of something, and then it's unification, right? So you have to have these two things in balance. You have to have capacity to include and see inclusion, and the capacity to exclude, right? You can't live in oneness experience, right? It's a great thing to be able to access, but you can't walk around and live in the world that way. And then, equity is, I think, a very dangerous idea. But
there's this book called "Seem Like a State" by James Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of this book? I'm reading it right now. It's very good. It speaks to a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I want to read that book. I haven't read that book, but I'm curious what comes up for you around the ideas within that book in reference to what I was just saying.
Well, basically a state, much like those who seek the kingdom of God, let's say, a state in our postmodern, whatever you want to call it, era, often finds itself being carried away by an impulse to superimpose utopia onto what it perceives as a mishmash of messiness. So like the people who constructed Brasilia, for example, when they were building architecturally, they had this philosophical belief in utopia, and utopia looked like a very specific thing in terms of architectural design, which is like straight lines. We want to get rid of the messiness of the streets. But when in fact there is an order to the streets, the state just can't detect it. Right? And so you can see this, I think, when the state tries to, race is a construct, and so the state tries to superimpose its perception of what racial equity looks like, but doesn't realize that, like, I wrote this recently in an essay that should be coming out soon about this is my real beef with Kendi, right? Kendi makes these sweeping statements about like equity, right? And that difference in outcomes is proof of difference of it's proof of racism, really. And but it's
not just racism, but sexism, transgenderism.
But like, specifically speaking about how to be an anti-racist, this text, right? But it's like, no, the Black community in Atlanta is actually different from the Black community in New Orleans. And the Black community in New Orleans is actually different from the Black community in Chicago, and so on and so forth. And to actually superimpose this like sweeping, totalizing vision onto quote unquote Black America is deeply colonizing. I'm going to reintroduce this this word in our lexicon, because it doesn't take into consideration that these communities have a very specific richness, a richness that is specific to the locale in which they emerged, right? Specific to the environment in which they emerge. And New Orleans is not Atlanta, and Atlanta is not Chicago, and Chicago is not Brooklyn, right? And if you are not, if you're a policymaker and your approach is not to co-create with the already existing environment or community in a specific environment, but instead to superimpose a sweeping vision, which is what states do, and how to see like a state, right? To superimpose a sweeping vision that has no awareness of that complexity, that complexification, it's actually deeply tyrannical.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I haven't read the book. I read Slate Star Codex's review of the book. And he talked about like, you know, you're trying, I'll give you an example. In Ireland, all the trees were basically destroyed to create English navies and then to grow sheep, right? They were overgrazed. So Ireland should be filled with Atlantic broadleaf rainforest, and it's not. So we should have trees, right? Well, they planted trees from where I am in the Pacific Northwest. They planted Douglas fir trees in straight lines, only Doug fir trees. They're tree plantations. So you can, you know, drive through the backlands of Ireland and see flat traditional Irish moors, and then there'll be a perfectly square 50 acres of Douglas fir trees. Right? And, you know, maybe that's better than just flat moorland, but it's incredibly not diverse. Yeah. Right. And it doesn't support the local wildlife. And it doesn't even support the traditional lifestyles that people had there. Right. If you look at a forest that would have been that was maintained in relationship to a more traditional lifestyle, say Italy, right? It's like you're going out and you're pollarding the trees in order to harvest certain things. You need to make sure there's enough tree cover, enough, you make sure there's enough oak trees in the forest because you're going to harvest the pigs that the boar, right? It's a big part of your local culinary tradition is harvesting the boars in the fall. And there's all these there's these layers of complexity in how we interact. And this is another point that Taleb makes, which is that we often try to hyper rationally create systems, right? If you want to maximize taxable income out of a plot of land, at some point you think it makes sense to just have as many Doug fir trees on that land as possible. But there's all these externalities that you don't see when you're a state, because it's not just the taxes, right? And this is why this is going to take us into a realm that's going to be really, really hard to try and get around through, because it gets so complex, because this is part of the critique of the capitalist system and the atomization in this weird way in which the conversation about race is actually in some strange way related to the desire of the sort of economic system, the machine, to actually homogenize people. Yes, and corporatize. Right? Yes, because the way that I think about it is that, are you familiar with the paperclip problem in AI? No. Okay, so the paperclip problem is basically this idea that if you had a artificial general intelligence that became sufficiently powerful to start scaling up its own intelligence, and it had been designed to optimize the function of paperclip factories, if its central prerogative was more paperclips, it would literally consume the world to create more paperclips. Yeah. And so in the AI space, everyone is worried about AI alignment and how we get these powerful intelligent machines to essentially work well with human well-being. Well, I had this sense some time ago that actually we already exist within the paperclip problem, because capitalism is essentially a type of collective intelligence. It's an artificial intelligence that we've created that optimizes for the production of things that are recognizable as capital. And so everything that contributes to the production of capital, the system wants to be as fungible as possible. It wants to be able to move those parts around and exchange them at clear rates in the easiest way possible. The problem with that is that human beings are the biggest producer of capital, right?
Sure.
But something like the breakdown of the family makes sense from capital's perspective, because if you have the best comparative advantage available to you living in Washington, D.C., and your romantic partner has his best comparative advantage in L.A., capital is going to be optimized by separating you. So when I see all this dialogue about how we have to get rid of the nuclear family and about how your friends are your family, what I think is that actually whatever else is behind it, it's getting picked up and propagated in part because it makes human beings more fungible.
So I followed it until the last part, because I followed everything you were saying until the last part, because I could easily see the last part becoming something going in a different direction.
Okay.
It's not inevitable. I could see actually the critique of the nuclear family resting in this very historical source, which is to say that like the Industrial Revolution created the nuclear family, or was a primary creator of it. And in fact, Camille Paglia makes this argument that like prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had extended families.
Yeah.
Right? Which is not the same thing as like your friends should be your family, which they should be, but not exclusively. Like the argument could be made, the argument against the nuclear family could also be a critique of capitalism, right? Which is to say that like we were formed in tribes where it wasn't just our mother and our father, it was our aunts and our grandparents, and we used to live closer to each other. Italian families historically, were like way more extended families. But overall, I think that there is a co-opting of the language of decolonization. And I've actually been deeply impacted by the work of Jordan Hall on this.
Okay.
When I see Jordan Hall in conversation with Vervaeke, I started like when he talks about localization and the importance of like being embedded in that local community.
Yes.
And how capitalism and market forces create this illusion within us, or creates this motivation within us to confuse having connections. This is what Vervaeke says: having connections for being connected. Right. And so like if I can create a product that has like millions of people buying it, then somehow my meaning is also super high, but it's actually not. And in fact, it's inversely correlated. The likelihood is inversely correlated. So you see this corporatization happening or coming up within identity politics, right? Where equity presupposes the perception that one Black America in this locale is the same as another Black America in another locale, and it's like, oh, let's just again superimpose a policy from above. When that's like fundamentally dehumanizing, and the same processes of colonization that we've been weirdly fighting against in rhetoric on the left, right?
Yeah.
But not deeply fighting in any real meaningful way. I would have never, by the way, predicted that I would be the person making this argument like 10 years ago, but here I am.
Yeah. So I think you point to something very true, which is that part of the critique of the nuclear family is is actually a desire to re-embed in deeper community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that the nuclear family is a little bit older than the Industrial Revolution. I think it comes out of the manorial system in early feudal France, but that's a slightly different conversation. But it's kind of specific to Western, Northwestern Europe, and then kind of spreads from there. But the interesting aspect of it is that the reality is what is replacing the nuclear family is not the extended family.
Right.
What's replacing the nuclear family is nothing.
Yes.
Right? What's replacing the nuclear family is Netflix and pornography and Halo. And so you could say that the critique has merit because it's pointing to something real, which is that this is maybe a very specific cultural artifact of Northern Europe that maybe doesn't fit every situation that well.
Sure.
And that there are that actually what we really need is not it's not just to go back to the 1950s and have everybody just sort of in their like perfect nuclear families. We need to actually have a deeper and wider conception of how we cultivate community.
Yes. I think that is the ultimate answer to, if not all of our problems, most of our problems.
I think it is too. Like, I think, like, I always feel strange when I give my critique of capitalism because I think that I end up sounding like a communist or a socialist, which I'm definitely not. I actually like really believe in like the market. I just believe that Adam Smith said it doesn't work unless you have virtuous people.
Right.
And it itself is not a generator of personal virtue. And so I think that we need to recognize that a well-aligned market system is only one of the functions, or one of the central institutions of a functional society, and that we have sacrificed really everything else to the god of capitalism right now. And we need to remember what the church was and what its functions were, what family and community were, what de Tocqueville's idea of Americans and all of the ways that they got together in these non-family, non-religious institutions as well, right?
Yeah.
Those organizations and that community is what we need. And and we need to do that in a way that respects locality and specificity, but helps us bridge gaps. Right? We have to be able to love and appreciate people who are different from us and what they contribute to our society. And our current dialogue seems like it's designed to do the opposite.
Yeah.
I think that we're well over the period of time that I asked of your time. So I really enjoyed this. This was a wonderful conversation. And it feels like there's a lot of unfinished lines, but maybe we'll another time. Maybe we can, maybe you, me, and John can have a conversation. We can continue some of these themes.
That'd be so cool. I would love that.
Yeah. So once again, I really want people to look into your work. I want people who are listening to this to recognize that there are ways to seek justice. There are ways to seek reconciliation and love that don't fall into the traps that of talismanizing the Black American or of scapegoating white Americans. We didn't talk about the scapegoat mechanism and Rene Girard, but it's another important element of this conversation.
For sure.
And I hope this conversation was an exemplification of that. And I thank you for joining me in.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Chloe.